Aloha kako. Welcome to our third workshop on breadfruit in a series of four. Today we'll be talking about pruning, propagation, orchard planning, and nutrient management. My name is Noa Lincoln. I'm a professor with UH Manoa in a position called Indigenous Crops and Cropping Systems. We also operate a farm in South Kona on the Big Island, Malakalaulu Cooperative, where we are restoring breadfruit agroforestry. The production advisor for several farms, including the Hawaii Ulu Producers Cooperative, which represents about 100 breadfruit farmers on Hawaii Island, and also serve on the board of several nonprofits focused on land management and agricultural production, and in particular the preservation of our heirloom Hawaiian crops. Like I said, this is the third workshop in a series of four. We did our first workshop in person at Kahumanu Farms back in February. Our second workshop was released around June or July, was also a virtual workshop. We have our workshop today, and our last workshop will focus on harvest and post-harvest preparation of breadfruit, and we really hope that we'll be able to do that one in person so we can share some awesome dishes with each other and taste the fruits of our labor. So yeah, we'll jump right into it. Start off with pruning. Want to start off by saying we did put out a small handbook in partnership with the Hawaii Ulu Producers Cooperative. You can find that handout at this web link here, https eatbreadfruit.com/pages/resources, and kind of provides an overview of some of the things that we'll talk about today. Also want to include a full disclaimer. Always consider safety first. Pruning can be dangerous, in particular if you're not well experienced with pruning. Climbing trees and using cutting instruments to sever large branches can certainly cause bodily harm. So please, please work appropriately, use appropriate gear, make sure you know what you're doing. And if you're unsure, please do hire a professional to conduct the work. When we talk about pruning, there's several types of pruning. Most of what we talk about is kind of structural pruning, the active shaping of trees for the preferred size and shape, keeping trees shorter so you can harvest them, keeping trees from getting too broad. So basically, yeah, forming your trees and maintaining them over time to be the size and shape that you want them to be. Other types of pruning, maintenance pruning is kind of just for tree health, making sure you're removing unnecessary or weak or dead or diseased sections of the tree. Basically pruning for the health of the tree rather than its shape or size. There's also rejuvenating pruning, especially in Hawaii. There's a lot of very old trees, really large, massive trees out there that may or may not be productive, and also even if they are productive, you might not be able to harvest them if the fruits are 80 feet off the ground. So thinking about how do we drastically change some of these old trees to bring them back into good production. And one final type we want to mention that an increasing amount of producers are doing is fruit thinning. So when you have a tree that's really bearing heavily, it can overbear and start to abort a lot of those fruit. So by pruning them and removing some of those fruits when they're young, you can actually increase your harvest. There's a lot of styles of pruning. Um, Structural pruning, so when you think about the shape that you want your tree, there's several kind of major shapes that people like to go for. One of the most classic ones is a central leader, where you have basically one main trunk, and then you're kind of shaping what's called the scaffolding branches, the lateral branches coming off that main trunk. These are often maintained in kind of a pyramidal shape, or kind of your classic apple tree, a nice spherical shape to the tree. But there are other options, multiple leaders, where you manipulate the tree to have multiple trunks coming out, often divergent trunks, so you're sending them off in different directions. That helps to sometimes make a wider or a fuller tree. There's also open vase pruning, which you kind of are shaping your tree like a bowl. This is a really intensive form of pruning, but really maximizes the light contact of the tree, which can really, really increase fruiting. You can get really high yields off of very small trees using this shape. And another common one we see, and this is more for the rejuvenating pruning, is called hat racking, and we'll see some examples of that. And essentially with these big, big trees, pulling them down, removing almost all the foliage, and essentially your tree kind of looks like a hat rack when you're done, but then that fleshes out and fills out with foliage if you do it correctly. So to start, I thought we'd take a look at the unpruned form of breadfruit. If left completely alone, most breadfruit will follow a very classic single leader form, where you have a central trunk and your lateral branches coming off of that. We'll talk a little bit more about the impact of varieties as we move forward, but most varieties will kind of follow this classic pattern if you don't do anything to them. So a classic tree will kind of take on this form of a very pyramidal shape, again driven by that central trunk, with side branches, and your lower branches, which are older, get longer. Your upper branches near the top of the tree are younger and shorter, so you again get this kind of pyramidal shape to the tree. So vast majority of the pruning that most people will do is simple topping. So taking that central leader and cutting it off at some point above the ground and trying to reduce that vertical growth and getting the tree to put more effort into its horizontal growth. This can be effective once you remove the dominant apical meristem, the dominant central trunk. The trees will often try to compensate and create a new central trunk. So pretty much every year, if you do this type of pruning where you're cutting off the central leader at the height that you want to maintain the tree, pretty much every year the tree will start to try to do a new leader and start shooting up again. So you can maintain this, but you have to go back year after year and keep cutting out those new leaders to keep your tree at a reasonable height. If you take your tree way down, you will tend to resprout with multiple leaders. So for a single leader tree, if you want, let's say, a 20-foot tall tree, you're going to cut that single trunk off at about 20 feet. If you want a 20-foot tree with multiple leaders, you're actually going to come in and cut that main stalk off much lower, down to 2, 3, 4 feet tall. And when that main trunk resprouts, it tends to put out multiple main trunks. And then you can follow the same pattern of a central leader and maintain each of those new trunks. And these trees tend to be a little wider and a little fuller than doing a central leader. Multiple leaders do take longer to develop because you have to, again, cut that main stem way down near the ground, and that kind of sets back the tree growth a couple years. But when these trees do flesh out, again, you tend to get a really nice full tree. And because the tree is distributing its growth across multiple trunks, it does tend to slow the vertical growth of the tree. And if you get a really nice multiple leader established, your pruning schedule might be more like every other year instead of every year. Here's the open vase pruning on breadfruit, again, where you kind of have a hollow center. So again, you're cutting off that main trunk really low to the ground. And as those new trunks resprout, you're constantly cutting off the vertical growth and supporting horizontal growth. So you got these very low trees that spread outward, and you kind of continually clean out that center part of the tree to create almost a bowl-shaped tree. And again, this really increases light interception. So you're not only getting light from the outer edge of the tree, as you do in a central or multiple leader, but you also get all this light into the center of the tree. And breadfruit is very photosensitive. It definitely needs light exposure to set fruit. And so these open vase prunings can, as you see on the left, can actually produce a lot of fruit, even though it's a very small tree. This does take a lot of maintenance, though. The farm that does this particular tree here, retiree who is out there, pretty much every day with a little jigsaw and just kind of again, almost every day out there shaping and keeping the trees in this form. And again, the final one we mentioned was hat racking, where again, if you have a really, really large tree, as you see on the left there, which is already halfway pruned, 80, 100-foot tall trees, you're pretty much bringing them back down below the level of the foliage. And this type of rejuvenating pruning, when you're done, you're pretty much just left with your big trunks and shaping those big trunks in a way that when the foliage regrows, you can get a nice thick growth. So again, topping is kind of the most common pruning, used basically to keep the plants shorter and more manageable, so you can harvest the fruit. One thing we want to point out about topping, so if we look at our uncut tree here and our kind of really classic breadfruit growth, when you do top a tree, you can see here pretty clearly that big light gap you cause on the top. And what you need to be careful about here is how much of a gap you open up in a tree. So if you top too much, if you lower the that central trunk too much, that hole we see at the top gets really big. The further down you're cutting, the bigger the hole you get. And that lets a lot of light into the interior of the tree. And if you let in too much light, the response of the tree is going to be to produce a whole bunch of new sprouts, very vertical sprouts that want to spring up and take advantage of that big light gap. And this is exactly what you don't want, is these new vertical branches. They're going to shoot straight up and start raising the height of your tree again. And so again, when you are topping or pruning, you always have to be balancing um, cutting it back now versus the regrowth you're going to see in the future. And so controlling or balancing how much light you let in, how much you're removing, is really, really important in how that tree is going to respond to that pruning. And again, this is why in general we suggest, you know, constant small pruning every year rather than really big prunings less often. Lateral pruning is something that we are seeing more of and are encouraging more of with a number of farmers. Um, when you look at the inside of a breadfruit tree, and in particular a variety like Ma'afala that's more compact and dense, um, it has a very uh, superficial canopy. That is, it's this nice dense canopy that's all on the outside of the tree. And if you poke your head inside that canopy and look in the inside, this is what you see. And essentially, it's just a whole bunch of wasted space. You have all this, bare branches, no lights, no fruit, no leaves. It's just the tree supporting these branches to hold the leaves up on the outside of the canopy. And there's nothing wrong with this, other than the fact that, again, nothing's really happening in here. And your tree continues to get wider and wider and wider and take up more and more space, but it's really only doing anything on the outside of that space, on the edges of that space. Um, so by engaging in lateral pruning, by taking in these side branches, you're basically increasing the efficiency of your land and not getting these big empty spaces within your tree that really aren't productive. Um, and in some cases, depending on the spacing of your tree, lateral pruning becomes a requirement. So, I mean, even at 30-foot spacings, breadfruit trees will easily grow into its neighbor. And once two trees start touching, they start shading each other out, and neither of them are going to set fruit. Um, Even if the trees aren't touching, maybe you can't get your lawnmower down between them, or you can't get your pickup truck down between them in order to harvest. And so over time, the need to reduce the space that the trees are taking up horizontally can also become a big issue, even though the emphasis is really on keeping the vertical growth down. Controlling the horizontal growth can also be a really good thing. So we still have a lot to learn, I would say, about pruning breadfruit. Um, in fact, all tropical fruit trees, I have been going through a big learning curve as far as pruning techniques. I think across the board, things are getting a lot better. But did want to share that one thing we've really noticed is how substantial the variety differences are with breadfruit. And, um, if you just take topping, for instance, if you top a ma'afala tree, seen on the left here, um, it pretty much evenly distributes its growth energy into all its lateral branches. So you top a Ma'afala and it just kind of doesn't get a whole lot taller, at least at first, and it kind of stays really balanced. All the lateral branches grow and get a little more vigorous and healthy, pretty much exactly what you want. Other varieties respond completely differently. If you have a Hawaiian ulu, a ulu Maori, and you top a ulu Maori, it will tend to take one of its lateral branches and turn it into a new leader and try to make that its new central trunk and go vertical with it. Other varieties, like Pua'a, for instance, if you top a Pua'a, it tends to do a multiple leader. You top a Pua'a once, and all of a sudden, 3 or 4 of the side branches will start to become vertical leaders. And so, understanding the different varieties and how they respond to pruning techniques is really important for being efficient. One last thing we want to mention is there is a lot of different strategies you can use. So again, we suggest kind of constant annual small pruning, but depending on the size of your orchard or the amount of labor you have available, that can really add up in terms of time and effort. And so some people might take a different approach of doing more drastic prunings less often. And this way you can kind of concentrate that labor into a shorter period of time. Um, you also might, for instance, in this case, bring in a machine like a bush hog or something and grind up all that pruning material as mulch. That might not be economic to do something like that if you have less material. Um, the jury, I would say, is still out in terms of how this affects overall productivity. We've seen some farmers engage in these heavy prunings, and you tend to get a light fruiting year, obviously following this, but then a couple of really nice heavy fruiting years. And then again, they'll come back through 3 or 4 years later and do a big heavy hit like this again. So a lot of different strategies that you can use. Moving on, we will talk very briefly about propagation. So again, we have put out a Ulu propagation technique little pamphlet, 4-page pamphlet, which can again be found at the same website at eatbreadfruit.com. And we're not going to talk too much about propagation because this handbook does a really good job of covering propagation. And also, propagation to me is the kind of thing that's much more efficient to cover in person with demonstrations. Um, so we're not going to spend much time talking about this, but if you are interested in growing your own trees, I highly suggest you go and check out this resource. Covers the basics, I think, pretty well and has some other resources for further reading in that area. Just quickly, we want to say there's a lot of different ways to propagate breadfruit. Breadfruit is Some breadfruit varieties are completely sterile, and they have to be clonally propagated, vegetatively propagated. And to do this, there's a number of ways that we cover again in this little pamphlet. So things like root sucker transplants, root cuttings, adventitious shoot cuttings, air layering, grafting. Tissue culture is probably out of reach for most home propagators, but That said, you can actually do tissue culture at home too if you look into that. And it is worth mentioning that a number of breadfruit varieties are not sterile and they do produce viable seed. Um, these seeds seem to be a little weak. We've grown a number of seeds and they perform surprisingly poorly. We have seen some vigorous shoots, and I'm sure it's possible to get some good breadfruit trees from seed, but we haven't seen a lot of experimentation or use of that method to date. Um, so next we want to go into orchard planning a little bit. Um, we're not going to go, obviously, we can't design an orchard for everybody. Everybody's situation's different. Um, what they want out of their orchard is different. How much management and maintenance they're going to put in is different. And so, how you design and implement your orchard is really a site specific and person specific thing. But we did want to share a number of key observations that we've seen in orchards across the state and in other locations as well. So one of the first things we wanted to mention was grass management. Vast majority of the orchards we see, um, tend to be installed in grass, and with most of that maintenance happening with mowing. But the presence of our large invasive grasses, things like cane grass and California grass and Guinea grass, these can really, really retard the growth of breadfruit. Um, we think it's because, breadfruit has a very shallow, sprawling root system, and just the root competition from these large grasses greatly slows the development. So this orchard on the Big Island, um, this is almost 6 years old now. Uh, we installed some trees nearby that are half the age and are already putting out 50 pounds of fruit a tree. And these trees, again, considerably older, and this year is their first year fruiting, and they're not even producing that much. Very similar site, climate, soils, and really the only difference is that we've done a much more aggressive job of controlling the grasses. Um, so yeah, these can be a big problem. And there's also a lot of ways to make them work for you. So this is a new orchard up in Kohala area, where they, are obviously still mowing, but they're just mowing around the trees, and they're actually letting these grasses get bigger to serve as a windbreak. And I was actually surprised at how well these trees are doing. I would have thought they needed a larger buffer from the grasses, but um, we've seen a couple instances now of a similar setup, and the trees are actually doing really well, even with just a couple meters of space from those grasses. So spacing is another really critical consideration in an orchard. And this relates, I would say, very strongly to pruning as well. The closer you have your trees, the more actively you're going to have to engage in the lateral pruning to make sure each tree has its own space. Uh, at an orchard on Oahu, about half their orchard is at 30-foot spacing, which we see here, with each tree having their own space. The other half of their orchard, the spacing's actually at 15 feet. And essentially what they've done there is just create hedgerows of ulu. And in that case, they've kind of sacrificed production of each tree on two sides, because as that tree touches its neighbor, those sides of the tree essentially become unproductive because they're not getting enough light to set fruit. But it also means that they only have to prune and harvest from two sides of the trees. They have nice big alleyways between them to drive a truck up and down, and instead of having to harvest all the way around the tree, they just harvest down these rows. It's kind of an interesting strategy. Again, as you plant your trees closer, you do have to engage in more pruning. So this is that open vase orchard. We saw some of their trees earlier, and they're actually pretty reasonably spaced, but the farmer does a really good job as well as keeping the trees laterally pruned and from spreading out too much, so that he maintains good alleyways between the trees for access and machinery. And we have seen the installation of a high density breadfruit test plot. So these trees are, I believe, just at 2-meter spacings, with the idea of very aggressively pruning them down, doing some training of limbs, and essentially trying to make a dwarf breadfruit tree collection. And these trees probably won't be as productive as a large tree with more space. But the question is, each tree is less productive, but you have a lot more trees. What does the final production per acreage look like? So there's not been a lot of work with these types of alternative planting regimes. So information and examples of these kind of more extreme planting layouts is really just starting to emerge for breadfruit. Cover cropping is a good way to bring some diversity of plants as well as of services to your orchard. The use of nitrogen fixing cover crops has been shown to increase yields of the breadfruit trees. Probably also helps with things such as beneficial insects, and it can also be a very aesthetic aspect of your orchard. We've seen a number of cover crops used right around the trees, both to kind of hold space and prevent some of the more aggressive weeds from coming in, and also again to potentially provide other benefits to your trees, such as nutrients or disease and pest resilience. And another big consideration is co-cropping. We definitely encourage, diversified systems for a number of reasons, but we do believe that they are just in general better systems in terms of the services they provide. So things like biodiversity and carbon capture, erosion control, nutrient efficiency, all of these things tend to be enhanced when you're growing multiple things together. There's different ways to do this, where you can have them segregated but in close proximity, such as here, where you have a row of breadfruit trees and then a a big chunk of Olena, in this case, turmeric. Um, and then they'll have another section of breadfruit, another section of another crop. Um, this is also really nice for breadfruit because breadfruit is highly seasonal. So in considering co-crops, seasonality, I think, is one of the core things to think about. Olena is really nice because your peak breadfruit season is kind of August to December, and then your Olena harvest and planting is more, January, February, March, and so you have this offset of labor and requirements as well as production for your farm. Other co-cropping can be a little bit more sporadic, um, where you have things more interspersed with each other. Here you tend to realize more of the ecosystem service benefits. You'll get a much higher level of biodiversity. So you start to get a lot of beneficial insects, which can help to control pests. Pests are a major disease vector, so you tend to see a decline in diseases when you have better integration of crops. And the extreme end of that then is kind of agroforestry systems, where you are essentially um, establishing very dense plantings, something that might look like or operate like a forest, except that everything in there is productive. And in these systems, again, you can get really, really high levels of benefits and really high levels of yields. Um, there are, of course, also trade-offs. The more diverse and interplanted your crops are, the harder it is to mechanize, tends to increase your labor cost in terms of things like harvesting. And also, if you're too diverse, you're also stuck with the issue of how do you market 50 different crops and get them to consumers. Whereas if you just have a handful of crops, that might be a little simpler of a supply chain for you to find markets and outlets for those crops. But again, all this kind of depends on what your purpose and mission is in growing your breadfruit. So just a really brief overview of plant nutrition. There's a number of what's called essential elements. These are things that plants absolutely need to survive. If they're missing any one of these, the plants will simply not be able to carry out their life cycle. And they tend to break them up into 6 macronutrients, so nitrogen, phosphorus, potassium, calcium, sulfur, magnesium, and these are the elements that are in really high supply. So if you do a nutrient analysis on your breadfruit leaves, these numbers come back in the percentages. An average leaf might be 1.5% nitrogen. And then you have your micronutrients, which again, they're still essential, they're still needed, but they're used in much, much lower quantities. So if you do any sort of nutrient test, these are reported in like parts per million. So much, much lower quantities are required. Just kind of the real 10,000-foot view of breadfruit nutrition. These are kind of some of the really key take-homes. The first of all is that breadfruit has a really high cation demand. So potassium, calcium, magnesium, breadfruit is really, really hungry for these things. Um, Cations are also referred to as salts. So they're positively charged ions in the soil. And this also means they're very mobile. So if you're in a spot that gets a lot of rain, your cations are some of the first things to get flushed out of your soil. And so, especially in wetter environments, and breadfruit likes wet environments, a lot of times you can be limited in your calcium and potassium and magnesium. And so, these are things that are good to think about in terms of ensuring you have some sort of supply for your trees. Um, Another one that we think is really important is to limit the amount of nitrogen you give your trees. Breadfruit is a soft-wooded tree. It's very fast growing. It can do a lot of vegetative growth. And the more nitrogen you give it, the more vegetative growth you encourage. And we've actually had farmers who were um, giving their trees a lot of nutrients, giving them a lot of cations, giving them everything they need, but also giving them a lot of nitrogen. And we find that these trees tend to not produce very much. And we've actually worked with a couple farmers, and just by cutting the nitrogen, not adjusting anything else, they actually increase their yields by putting on less nitrogen into their system. Um, the micronutrients seem to rarely be an issue with breadfruit. We have seen a couple things that seem like it might be a boron or a zinc deficiency. And certainly in some Hawaiian systems, you do get boron and zinc deficiencies. But again, it does not seem like a major issue with breadfruit. And again, because these micronutrients are used in really low quantities, even a one-time application of micronutrients for the lifetime of a tree um, is potentially okay. Although there does need to be more work in this area to really understand it. Um, and finally, that breadfruit has a pretty low phosphorus demand. And in addition, breadfruit has really strong mycorrhizal associations, fungal associations, and these mycorrhizae, these fungus, their main role is actually scavenging phosphorus for plants, and so the plants feed the fungus carbon, and in exchange, these fungus scavenge phosphorus for the trees. So not only does breadfruit have a pretty low phosphorus demand, but it has a really good mechanism to get phosphorus. So again, it's one of those nutrients that you probably don't need to worry too much about. Um, so we've come out with some recent preliminary suggestions about breadfruit nutrients. And these are kind of the suggested ratios that we're putting out there. So about a 10-4-30 for nitrogen, phosphorus, potassium. This is really similar profile to bananas. So any sort of banana fertilizer or coffee cherry is also pretty similar. I think coffee cherry is like a 10-5-20. Um, those are really good profiles for breadfruit as well. And in fact, the farmer who's getting 900 pounds per tree, he's using coffee cherry fertilizer as well. Um, and again, breadfruit does have that high cation demand, so it has a pretty high calcium magnesium demand. And so in proportion to the NPK, for calcium, magnesium, sulfur, you want a ratio of about 6-5-2. So one way to look at the issue of nutrients is, naturally a tree takes up nutrients from the ground. It uses them to produce its fruit and its leaves and its branches. And as those die, they fall onto the ground, and those nutrients go back in the soil for the tree to take up again. Um, it's different with agriculture, right? Because we're harvesting those fruits, we're removing those nutrients from the system. And every year, year after year, if your breadfruit tree is producing several hundred pounds of fruit and you're harvesting all that fruit and taking it away, you're removing a lot of these elements from the soil that the plant needs. Um, so if your tree, we think a 500-pound harvest per tree is a very reasonable target for any grower. Um, and if you just look at how much nutrients you need to replace to compensate for the nutrients you remove with 500 pounds of fruit, these are the numbers. So if you're harvesting 500 pounds per tree, you're taking over 6 pounds of nitrogen and almost 20 pounds of potassium from that system every year for every tree. And this is the amount of nutrients that that tree is going to have to come up with if it wants to produce another 500 pounds. Um, so this is one way we look at nutrient management is, hey, let's just, try to replace what we're taking away. Um, and again, these are the numbers here of about how much of each element you need to be putting back in that tree to compensate for what you take out. Um, we are not going to go into any specific fertilizers or suggestions. We try to do everything as naturally as possible. So we look for um, uh, naturally occurring sources of these nutrients. So, for instance, for things like potassium, almost anything from the ocean is really good. Seaweeds have a really, really high potassium count. Um, we know some farmers who are partnering with invasive seaweed removal, and then they take all that seaweed and they put it on their breadfruit trees, and that's their potassium source. For calcium, right, things like eggshell or oyster shells are really, really good sources, and if you can score, a few 100 pounds of oyster shells and you put them out in a orchard, that's your calcium supply for like the next 20 years as those things really slowly break down and have a nice constant supply of calcium to your soil. So that's kind of the tact we take. But bottom line is you're taking nutrients away, and you got to make sure you're putting them back somehow. For people who want to be more serious about managing nutrients, you can actually look at the nutrient status of your tree. So we've done a fair bit of work trying to create a protocol for examining tree nutrition in breadfruit. And what we determined through analyzing thousands and thousands of breadfruit leaves um, that the best thing to do is to harvest the petiole of the third fully open leaf from the branch tips. Um, so the petiole is the stem of the leaf. So at the base of the leaf where it attaches to the tree, and you find some canopy branches, and you harvest those leaves, and you cut off that petiole. And if you send that into any agricultural diagnostic center, they can give you the nutrient concentrations of that petiole. And from there, we've kind of developed some initial guidelines around what are optimal low and high ranges of nutrients in those leaves. So if you do get that petiole tested, this is a free publication we have out that has this table in it. And you could, again, harvest your petiole, send it to an ag diagnostics, cost about $10 or so, and you get your numbers back. And then for each of the elements, you can look at your numbers and see how they match up to this table. And for instance, if with nitrogen you go, oh, my nitrogen was at 0.8%, I'm in the low range, my tree probably could use some more nitrogen to get it up into that optimal range. So this is work that we're still doing and still refining and developing, but it is work that we found is really, really impactful. We've worked with a number of farmers um, to change their nutrient management strategies, and we've seen results, really substantial results. We've seen farmers go from 200 pounds a tree to 600 pounds a tree in 1 year of changing their nutrient management. Um, we've seen another farmer who year after year after year, she was getting fruit drop that was like 90 to 95% of her harvest, she said. The tree was just aborting all its fruit. We worked with her on her nutrient management. Now she says she has like maybe 10% fruit drop, and her harvest has gone from almost nothing up to several hundred pounds a year. So yeah, you take care of these trees, and they will take care of you as well. Um, yeah, so that concludes this presentation. As always, I'm very welcome any questions or comments or discussion. You can contact me at nlincoln@hawaii.edu. Um, we always have to shout out to our funders and partners over the years who have helped on this work. And with that, I will say mahalo, thank you, and feel free to reach out. Hui ho.